welcome to Second Features. In this episode, we are talking about a film which is kind of a little bit off-brand for us, but no less interesting. It's called Pumping Iron, and it's a 1977 film all about bodybuilding. You may have heard of it. It's actually a documentary, and it's notable for starring a young Arnold Schwarzenegger in one of his first major breakout roles, as well as Lou Ferrigno, who, of course, played the Hulk in various iterations over the years. So we're talking about that today, and we're also hearing from a very special guest, Adrian.
Yes, no, not me, but Dr.
No,
Adam
no, no. We're
Knox.
not hearing from Adrian. We're hearing from Adrian's very special guest.
Yeah, so Adam is at the University of Chichester, and I know him primarily for teaching and talking about horror, but in his other half of his academic career, he's written about bodybuilding and edited books on bodybuilding. So, and maybe even done some bodybuilding. We can ask him.
Yeah.
So I thought he would be the perfect guest to come and explain to us what bodybuilding is all about.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been working out ever since I watched this movie. I'm getting ripped.
I always work out, and I'm always in the process of getting ripped. It's very important not to shirk your fitness, Adrian.
No, yeah, this is a very inspiring film. Um, yeah, but so for me, this was the first time I'd ever seen it, even though I'd been aware of it for years. How about you?
It was the first time. I had vaguely heard of it. I'd heard more about Pumping Iron 2, The Women, which is about female bodybuilding. And that's a kind of
Oh,
a documentary which is often framed in a more shocking way because of how women's bodies are not normally associated with being muscular or, with
hmm,
bodybuilding. But the first film I'd heard was kind of really, really good and really sort of critically rated. But I'd never kind of given it a watch. I really enjoyed it. I really thought it was just
hmm.
fascinating. It was an insight into a world that I just didn't. I mean, I kind of knew it existed, but I didn't know anything about it.
No. What I particularly, I mean, there's lots of aspects of it that I enjoyed, but I loved the whole Lou Ferrigno subplot of him with his family and his dad, who was his dad a cop, I think, and
Yeah.
he'd given up being a cop to be his trainer, and you just they're in Brooklyn, and you so because obviously this is just all shot on the streets and everywhere they are. Um, and you
Well,
see him going to this gym in Brooklyn, and everything you see all these guys in the background wherever they go, and it feels like you're in a Scorsese movie. That there's just all these kind of guys in their open shirts looking a little bit like
I mean,
scary
it is
to
kind
me.
of it is kind of that era. It's
It was
only a
great.
couple of years
Yeah.
after Rocky, which is filmed in gyms on the streets.
Mm.
In Philadelphia. Was it Philadelphia? Is it? I can't remember.
Yes.
I
I
just
think
literally
so.
watched that last week. Anyway, yeah, I mean it's kind of maybe I mean it's a documentary, but it does have a plot, and it is kind of dramatized,
Mm.
Pumping Iron, because it's kind of semi-dramatized in that it's not candid; it just looks candid. So
Oh
we
no.
we're
You're
kind of
spoiling it for me now. I thought that was all happening.
no. I think like it's that kind of structured documentary where the camera's in the room and it's capturing people's behavior, but also it's kind of some of it is sort of partly characterized. So
Oh, okay.
we have characters like Arnold Schwarzenegger is kind of very much playing himself, but he's also being himself, and but it's kind of also quite
Mm.
hard to get a handle on him because he's such a kind of enigmatic, entertaining personality. And then we have Lou
Yeah.
Ferrigno, who is training to be Mr. Olympia. Is Mr. Olympia, isn't it? The
Yeah, there's Mr.
competition.
Universe, and then there's Mr. Universe, and then there's Mr. Olympia,
Yeah.
which is all the winners of the Mr. Universes.
So like
Universe,
Mr.
I don't know.
Universe is I thought
Yeah.
like an amateur one, and Mr. Olympia is the
Mm,
professional one. But anyway, I mean it's about
something like that.
training to win this competition, Mr. Olympia.
Yeah.
Um, and it's kind of just about bodybuilding and how these guys train and how they relate to each other and the importance of this competition uh, in their
Mm,
lives. So Arnold Schwarzenegger is he's won Mr. Universe several times over. He's won Mr. Olympia many times, and he is kind of at the height of
Yeah.
his career. He is just about to retire, and then Lou Ferrigno is coming along, and he's relatively new to it. And there's kind of like a rivalry there.
Yeah, and you can really see Arnie is so charismatic. You can see why they focused on him in the documentary. And yeah, I really enjoyed that about. I don't know what I was expecting really from this. I thought he was just going to be one of the characters rather than becoming the main character, but you can just see how much the camera loves him,
Mm-hmm.
really. And and he's genuinely quite funny in the way he kind of. There's moments where he's teasing Lou Ferrigno a
Yeah,
little bit when but in a kind of quite fun way because he's sitting together with his family, eating breakfast before the competition, and just having I don't know. There's something about him that I could see why he would be about to announce his retirement and then go on to become a movie star.
I think he always kind of
You could
wanted,
just
like, he, I've been doing a bit of background reading on Arnie for this, and plus, he's just such a fascinating guy. But there's like Arnie the
mm,
myth, and there is Arnie the character, and he almost
mm,
like blends a lot of truth with fiction, and he kind of,
mm,
you get the sense that he is very involved in curating his image, and he always has been, even from the age of like 8 years old. Like you get
mm,
this kind of, he's got this very like performative aspect to him, but um,
mm.
somehow it's kind of not inauthentic. But he is really, really funny and engaging. And he, like, the first bit of Pumping Iron is him telling a story about how bodybuilding is like sex. And he throws it
Oh
kind of
yeah,
offhand. And then the rest of the film is
yeah,
him just saying a lot of like things that sound kind of shocking, but he's like, yeah, this is who I
yeah,
am. This is what I do.
The greatest feeling you can get in a gym, or the most satisfying feeling you can get in the gym, is the pump. Let's say you train your biceps. Blood is rushing into your muscles, and that's what we call the pump. Your muscles get a really tight feeling, like your skin is going to explode any minute. It's really tight. It's like somebody blowing air into your muscle. It just blows up, and it feels different. It feels fantastic. It's as satisfying to me as coming is, as having sex with a woman and coming. And so can you believe how much I am in heaven? I'm like getting the feeling of coming in the gym. I'm getting the feeling of coming at home. I'm getting the feeling of coming backstage when I pump up, when I pose out in front of 5,000 people. I get the same feeling. So I'm coming day and night. I mean, it's terrific, right?
he is very good at the sound bites. But like, there's the whole thing. I guess it's possibly become a little bit controversial where he talks about how he can relate to dictator or not relate to them, but he admires dictators and
Didn't
people
he?
who've got a strong image. He says he admires powerful people, even fascists, I think he said. And then he also balances that out by saying even Jesus, like people who've got a lot of power and people look up to them and respect them. He admires that in other people, which I thought was quite interesting.
No, I think there's a lot of this like trying to be shocking and trying to provoke with the stuff that
Yeah,
he's saying.
sure. But of course, then he did later on become a Republican governor, so it all makes sense.
So he is, yeah, he's a megalomaniac, isn't he? He wants to rule the world. Next stop, the presidency.
Yeah, yeah.
It was always part of his master plan.
He did have a few film roles, quite small roles before this. Like he's got a background role in The Long Goodbye a few years before this. He did actually have a starring role. I don't know. Have you ever seen Hercules in New York?
Yeah, like a
Where
long time
he
ago.
yeah they call in the credits he's called Arnold Strong, which is pretty funny.
Wasn't he dubbed in that because his
Because
accent was too thick and they
yeah,
didn't think audiences would
he
understand
is.
him?
Yeah, he's got this really bland American voice. Although the version I've seen of Hercules in New York, I think they'd lost I don't know what had happened, but it was his original voice on it, and not the dubbed voice. And it does sound pretty strong at the time. And it's a terrible, terrible film, but it's also really funny. There's a
Yeah.
bit where he wrestles somebody dressed as a bear in Central Park, so it's it's worth seeing for that. But he obviously had his sights set pretty high, um, and you can almost I don't know, but I don't know whether anybody watching this documentary would have thought he's going to become the biggest movie star of the 80s and possibly the 90s. I'm
Probably
not
no,
sure
but
if that was
like
necessary.
because it hadn't been done. Because I mean, you have to kind of admire
Mm,
him in that he knew he was going to be a star. Like he went out into the world and made lots of sacrifices and just knew he was going to be like literally king of the universe, like Mr. Universe,
mm,
Mr. Olympia. And then he had a plan to retire from bodybuilding and then pursue an acting career. And this is a guy who is a foreigner trying to make it in the mainstream Hollywood industry with a very thick accent and an unpronounceable name to people at the time. And you just
mhm.
have to admire the fact that he's like, yeah, no, I am going to be the biggest movie star. And then he was. Like he has at the time, just the idea of an actor breaking in from Europe, uh, who kind of has that kind of strong accent and would find it difficult to position themselves in the market. The fact that he then kind of went on to do that, I think, is pretty impressive.
It's interesting how they talk about in the film. He's just massive. He's so
Is
huge in
is he
this
not? Is
movie.
he not like short though? Is he not shorter than Lou Ferrigno? Is that not a whole thing?
Yes, he is shorter than Lou Ferrigno is
Like
about.
he's huge. He's
I think
short.
I think they said yeah. I think they said Arnie was 6'2" and Lou Ferrigno is 6'5", I think. And Lou
Mm,
Ferrigno weighed an extra 50 pounds, so he was definitely bigger. And I think they were hoping that that would mean he had a chance of beating Arnie because he's so much bigger. But Arnie had the charisma, I think. And did you notice when in that final competition, whenever they're reading out the names of all the contestants, they always said the one and only Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like you could
mm.
tell just from the announcing that it was a foregone conclusion who was going to win.
Yeah, I mean, he was already such a.
So,
He was just in that bodybuilding world. He was just
hmm,
like the figurehead, wasn't he? At that point.
yeah. But so there's him and Lou, but we also get to meet some of the other contestants along the way. So did you have any sort of favorite characters from the
Um.
movie?
Well, the school teacher guy, with the
Mm,
comb over. What was his name? You liked him, didn't you?
Mike Katz. Yeah, Mike Katz. He
Um.
oh, he's
Yeah.
so good.
I just felt
He's
really
the
sorry for him.
yeah, because this what I like about this film is it feels very much it fits in the mold of the kind of like the Maisels brothers or Don't Look is it Don't Look Back, the Bob Dylan film,
Mm,
sort of fly on the wall stuff. And but the thing it made me think of the most was Christopher Guest documentaries, like obviously Spinal Tap, but
mm.
also Best in Show in particular, um, and the folk music one. I forgot what that's called. But anyway, but Mike Katz feels like a character straight out of a Christopher Guest movie that
Yeah.
one of the things I loved with a lot of these guys, you see all these guys are at the gym or we're talking to them backstage and things, and they've got these huge kind of Adonis classical bodies, but then they've got 70s mustaches and 70s hair. And Mike Katz is like that. He's really ripped, but then he's got the most kind of 70s comb over hair.
He has the head of a primary
Um,
school teacher and the body of a Mr.
yeah,
Olympia.
which he is. And I was thinking, he talks about being a primary school teacher, and just imagine the awe and slight fear that those kids must have of him. But he's also the nicest guy.
Oh,
And
he
there's
seems
the whole
super
subplot
nice,
with
and they
him.
make fun of him, and it's just like,
Yeah,
oh, he's such a nice
yeah.
guy.
Because he's an amateur in this professional world. And he goes to South Africa to this contest, and he's got a friend there who's also competing against him, who plays a prank on him, which I thought was all completely spontaneous, but you think it was actually set up for the
I think it
camera,
was
which I know.
staged. I think it was dramatized.
Yeah, but it was pretty funny where he's hidden his t-shirt to just to try and mess with his mind a little bit. So he's walking around trying to find his missing t-shirt. Like he only like would you really go to a contest and only have one t-shirt with you? I don't quite.
I
I
would.
suppose
That's something I would do, and forget my toothbrush as well. like there's lots of psyching out in this film. The bodybuilders try and just get one over on each other. They play pranks, but they also try and intimidate each other. But they don't intimidate. I mean, they intimidate each other with their own muscles. They walk around and just kind of work out, and they train together. And they're
Yeah,
like, I weigh this much, and you weigh this much. But there's a psychological element to kind of like, especially the way Arnold Schwarzenegger relates to all the other bodybuilders, and especially Lou Ferrigno, the way he just kind of like he's pretending to be joking, but he's also psyching him out. He's like, yeah, you can't
yeah.
do this, or I'm the best, I'm the biggest, I'm gonna win. I'm not paraphrasing, but that's kind of his energy.
The contrast between Arnie and Lou is really interesting, especially because Arnie he's a California guy and he's training at this gym where all the kind of muscle guys train. This massive, really brightly lit, quite airy gym, and all these good-looking buff guys looking at themselves in the mirror constantly, checking how their muscles are doing. And then we go to Brooklyn and we see Lou Ferrigno in this brown, really kind of dingy gym that's got brown wooden paneling and all these guys in the background that again look like extras in a Scorsese movie. And it just seems, and he's for definite. Although Ferrigno is bigger, he's definitely the underdog in this film in the way he's portrayed. He's
He's
obviously
Yeah.
younger and everything as well, and obviously he's also. I'm not sure how deaf he is, but he's definitely hard of hearing, which is interesting.
Mm,
They talk about
yeah,
that a little
he's
bit in the
partially
film.
deaf. He doesn't have a
Yeah,
lot of nous, like he doesn't have a lot of guile. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger, he has
no,
all the guile. He has he's manipulating
yeah.
people constantly.
And yeah, it's partly through the editing as well that they decided to make Arnie the star of the movie, because Arnie does a lot of talking, and Lou doesn't really get to speak that much to camera himself. We have conversations between him and his dad, but he's not talking about how much he loves bodybuilding and telling funny stories, and we don't
Yeah,
get that much of that with him really.
we're not getting his motivations, but we sure as hell hear a lot about
No,
Arnie's.
yeah, yeah, but no, it's kind of sad at the end. But then because Arnold retires when he's won again, spoiler alert, he wins again.
That is a
This
massive
I guess
spoiler.
this yeah, oh, come on, it's 40
It's
years
the
old.
biggest
The
spoiler.
the sense is that because he's retired now, Lou has got a chance next year because he's a lot younger than Arnie, I think.
Yeah,
Of course,
there's
little did
a
Lou know that in a few years he was also going to be a massive star on television, but painted green.
yeah, he was the Incredible Hulk. Um, there is kind of a funny story there. I read about, unfortunately, probably on Wikipedia or something. I can't remember, but I read about they both auditioned for the Incredible Hulk. Lou Ferrigno and Arnie. They
Ah,
both auditioned for it, but Lou got it because he was taller. So
ah,
that is
which
why Lou Ferrigno kind of got the
makes
role.
sense.
Yeah, and then at that point, Arnie was doing just about to do Conan a couple of years later, but he wasn't like a massive star yet. So
Mm,
that must have really kind of, yeah,
yeah,
that must have hurt.
yeah, because I think they started that first series of the Incredible Hulk came out the same year as this film. So Lou Ferrigno actually became a kind of media star on the television, at least before Arnie really did. And he did. I'm just looking on the IMDb. I think he did about 80 odd episodes or something of the Hulk. So he sort of got in the immediate short term, at least, he got the last laugh by becoming a big television star, whilst Arnie was still sort of scraping around for film roles.
I think Arnie probably had
But
the last
ultimately,
last laugh. Yeah, the ultimate
yeah,
laugh.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, although he finished Hulk in 1982, and he's basically been trading on that ever since. But he also did do a couple of fun Italian films. He went to Italy and did a Hercules movie in the
Did
80s and a
he?
Sinbad movie.
Oh yeah,
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 his
I vaguely
Hercules
remember
film
that.
is
Yeah.
yeah, the Hercules one. It's actually Luigi Cozzi directed that, and it's like Hercules meets Star Wars basically. It's more sci-fi than it is fantasy. It's pretty funny.
Didn't we just do a podcast on a film like that?
I know. Yeah, I think we should probably let's not go there. Yeah, But what do you think about the sort of the tone of Pumping Iron? Are they like, it is very, like you said, there's a female one, Pumping Iron 2. This is a very male focused film. There's a lot of testosterone on
I
screen.
thought,
There's very little.
okay, so I tried to find how much academic work there had been on this film, and I found a hell of a lot more on Pumping Iron 2, relating to kind of gender in the body and the monstrous feminine
Mm,
and all that stuff. But what I think Pumping Iron, the original, is actually really interesting from a sort of gender studies and gendered body perspective, because you'd expect it to be kind of, there's a lot of masculinity and masculine performance, but there's also a lot of that's also undermined constantly. And there's actually, like,
mm,
all of these men are narcissists. They're obsessed with their bodies, and they're obsessed with each other's bodies in a way that they're attracted
yeah,
to each other, but they're also jealous of each other. And there is some great
yeah,
kind of, that tone is really interesting, and I wanted to kind of dig into that more and look at more academic work on that, but I couldn't really find that much.
mm,
But yeah, there's
yeah. I mean, it's
definitely, like, the film is kind of important for talking about masculinity. Maybe we can ask Adam about that
yeah,
later.
because it's not camp, is it? I wouldn't say it was camp, or even it's not. There's not even a sense that when the filmmakers are putting it together, they were trying to uh, highlight any sort of homoeroticism or anything like that. There's no, which could have been. I think in another, you could have made this same film and made it a lot more overt if there was any sense of sort of campness in what they're doing. But I think that doesn't really come across. I don't know. What do you
No,
think?
not really. I mean, it's wasn't it was it made by someone who is sort of in that world or involved in that world?
Yeah,
It kind of comes
which
across as
I
quite
don't really know.
respectful. I think they ran out of
Yeah.
money at a certain point and had to try and raise it by getting the bodybuilders to kind of perform on stage and raise money.
Uh-huh.
So I think it's actually from within the world of bodybuilding, this documentary.
Yeah.
So not really, and it never feels like we're kind of making fun or looking at it from the outside. It
Mm,
always feels as though we're inside that world. And when we're kind of literally in the gym, it feels like as the camera's kind of positioned as though we are actually kind of in the gym, talking to these
mm,
guys. But I just find it
yeah.
really fascinating the way they talk about their bodies, the way they look at each other. Like, there's this great bit at the
Mm,
start where Arnie is talking about what bodybuilding is, and he compares it to sculpting, and he said, a
mm,
sculptor will sculpt a figure and maybe add more clay if something's not symmetrical. A bodybuilder will just lift more and add more to this muscle.
hmm.
So he compares it to sculpting
Yeah.
the body and to art. And there's also like a whole Grecian Olympian kind of like aspect to how these men are statuesque, like figurines, like
Yeah.
almost sculptures.
Absolutely. I also really liked the fact that the very opening shots of this film is Arnie and one of the other guys learning how to move from a ballet dancer. I thought that was very interesting.
Oh yeah,
That's not the
yeah,
thing that you would expect to see at the beginning of this film. You'd expect to go straight in with the weights, but it's actually they're learning about how to move when they're doing their poses, which I
yeah.
thought was very interesting. A lot more like these guys, once they're out on stage at these shows, they're not lifting weights. The weightlifting is all behind the scenes. It's purely about the posing,
Yeah. And they are
which
conscious of being
it,
looked at all the time. They're always conscious
mm,
of being looked
yeah.
at. I was going to ask if you work out, like if you like have ever done bodybuilding, Adrian.
Do you even lift, bro?
Do you even lift, Adrian?
Uh,
What do you
yeah.
bench?
I'm lifting right now whilst I'm recording, just off camera here.
You're just lifting your son in one arm, just above your head.
Yeah. I well, it's interesting watching stuff like this, and then also the marathon over the weekend did make me think I really should do more, really get more exercise. One of my colleagues at work was running the marathon yesterday. I've got other colleagues who cycle to work every day, and it makes me think I should get out there a bit more. But no, I did once own a weights bench when I was a student.
You once owned,
But you
but
know
you
what?
didn't use it. But you didn't use
Yeah,
it. You just owned it.
I mainly used it to hang washing on in my room. It's one of those things where people buy weights benches and then immediately regret it and then sell it to you for a tenner. It was one of those. So occasionally I'd give it a go, but no, feeble,
No, see, consistency, that's
absolutely
the thing. It
feeble.
has to be every day. Or,
Yeah,
every
yeah.
other day. I don't know. I think it might be dangerous to do it every day, but yeah. Consistency, Adrian. That's what's required to build up muscles
Yes.
like Arnie.
Actually, you mentioned their injuries. We don't see a lot of that. I was expecting there to be more drama with people tearing ligaments and dropping weights on their feet and all that, but there wasn't any of that. They
I
made
think
it seem like it's perfectly
maybe
safe.
like the first rule of being a bodybuilder is that you don't drop the weights on your feet. maybe
Yeah,
that's what you learn in week 1. But no, you're right. There wasn't a sense of like the body wearing out, I guess, or being like injured.
yeah, yeah. Or just what are the long-term health implications of having your body like that? Because obviously,
Yeah.
if once they stop pumping iron, it all starts to sag a bit. I think.
Well, yeah. I
I
mean,
think I don't really know, but
as the Radiohead song says, gravity always wins. Yeah.
that's true. That is what I didn't realize Tom York was bench pressing when he was singing about that, but that makes sense.
No, I'm not an image I can hold in my head. It's not something I can imagine. But yeah,
No, not
I
really.
you're right. Actually, I expected more of that stuff. Like more
Mm,
of what what does this take from the body? What does it entail to go through all of this? And
mm.
having older bodybuilders to kind of tell the younger guys like what to expect.
There's one. I think my favourite shot from the movie is when Lou Ferrigno walks into his gym in Brooklyn, and the camera kind of lingers on this guy standing in the background, and he's got like just a white vest on. He's got a bit of a paunch. He's got sort of slightly receding curly hair, and he's just doing one barbell in one arm that's quite small. And you see him just look at Ferrigno as he goes past, and then look at the camera, and he's just in the background, doesn't speak or nothing. And for some reason, that's the guy of all the people in the film. He's the one that's stuck in my mind the most as this kind of image of 70s New York in this gym. He's doing his best. He's like a little chubby guy with
Mm.
his one weight in his arm. And then, right, the Hulk just comes walking past him. And it's got to be a bit intimidating. It's got to make you feel like, oh, what's the point?
Yeah.
But
You
yeah,
like they're all kind of friends, the bodybuilders, but they're all also kind of competing against each other. So there's friendly rivalry, but also like you get the sense of constant obsession with each other's bodies. Like just kind of comparing yourself endlessly to this parade of hyper muscular men must be a bit draining.
Tell Louis that I said hi.
Yeah?
Said to his father that I said hi. And I'm looking forward to seeing him in South Africa. Okay?
Alright. In other words, you want me to be very nice.
Be very nice to him.
Okay.
Because he needs a lot of help.
See, the king of the hill can only go down.
That's right.
The king of the hill can only go down.
Or stay up.
Or he can stay on that hill.
Right.
That's
Stay on
the
the
other
hill.
possibility.
Can stay on the hill. Right.
Stay up.
But the wolf on the hill. But look, the wolf on the hill, right, is not as hungry as the wolf climbing the hill.
That's true.
See?
He's not as hungry, but
Not
when
as
he wants the
hungry.
food, it's there.
I'd like to welcome to the podcast now Dr. Adam Locks, and he is the program coordinator of media studies at the University of Chichester. You are primarily a horror guy, right? In terms of your teaching, my experience of what you teach is you teach a lot of horror and Hollywood and all this kind of stuff, and you also quite regularly hold events at the University of Chichester, including some quite exciting events over the last few years or so.
That's true. Well, I've definitely moved, probably like you, like a lot of us, much more to cinema, and film has been where I've wanted to move for a long time, really. And that's my comfort zone. That's what I do. So horror, war films, Hollywood, as you said. global TV and cinema. So they're the sorts of areas I look at. Yeah, I do TV as well. And yeah, we do events. Pre-COVID, we did lots of events. And of course, then that went by the wayside. And someone said, well, just keep doing them by Zoom. But the whole point of them was we wanted them to be theatrical and in a theatre where everyone's very excited about the guest appearing, and you had some music and a show reel before they came on. So it was all that pizzazz was always very exciting. So yes, I'm looking forward to getting back to that because we had the last guest was Robert Wade, who obviously was one of the writers of No Time to Die.
Oh, cool.
He came on just before COVID hit, so we're all expecting the film to be released, but it wasn't until almost 2 years later.
Yeah.
But there, anyway.
And so that's quite a long way from bodybuilding.
Yes.
And that's sort of an interesting journey that you've gone on from bodybuilding to interviewing Hollywood celebs.
It's a bit different. Yes, it's strange. I mean, this sounds like this is your life. But yes, I very quickly, I was an English lit and American studies undergraduate, and I did my dissertation on bodybuilding because I was trying to find something interesting to do, and I was very into Nietzsche at the time, like a lot of students, and I came across a book called Exceedingly Nietzsche, which sounds like something from Mr. Kipling. And Exceedingly Nietzsche had this incredible essay by a guy who sounds like he's from Harry Potter. He was called Alfonso Lingus.
That sounds kind of rude.
It does a bit. Actually, yes. I've got to be careful here. And Alfonso Lingus wrote this essay called Orchids and Muscles, which was all about bodybuilding. I'd never read anything on the subculture, and it was fascinating. And of course, there's an area for research because we're obviously always looking for the obscure, aren't we? I mean, look at what you two do. Look at the strange, the weird, the marginal, the misunderstood, and bodybuilding just ticked all those boxes for me, and I did that for my undergraduate study. And then I did it as a PhD as well. Yeah,
it's such a fascinating area of research. I'd never even considered it. Like yourself, I'm an English lit sort of history undergrad, and I was sort of looking for my niche as well, and that ended up being, music hall and cinema. But bodybuilding is just kind of like really out there. What is it like? So were you kind of researching the history of it when you first started, or was it more like the industry as it was, at the time?
It was all sorts, really. It was a mix of approaches, but I suppose my comfort zone has always been gender studies, gender and sexuality. So it was looking at bodies and just trying to understand these bodies and how did these bodies get to where they were in terms of excessiveness. But at the same time, it was very interested in, as you say, the industry, who runs these competitions and what's the ideology behind it and how did things work. I was very interested about how it worked. So there was a variety of things I was doing. And then when it went to the PhD, it also became quite historical as well. And obviously there was a number of key sources I used as well. I mean, I should stress as well, from the PhD came a couple of books with Routledge. So I was very lucky to be co-authored with a guy called Niall Richardson. You know him, Adrian, from Sussex.
Yeah. So that was Critical Readings in Bodybuilding.
Exactly. It's a great book to read if you can't sleep at night. Just pick that up. Pick that up. You'll be out.
It's surprisingly heavy.
It is heavy, like the men and women.
As you would expect. You've got to have a workout to lift it up.
Exactly. You can use it as a dumbbell. But in all honesty, I mean, what was fantastic about that book was that we managed to bring in all the world authorities on bodybuilding from academic perspectives, from a variety of different, sociology, history, and brought them in to talk about bodybuilding. It was amazing. Particularly someone I really looked up to called Kenneth Dutton, who's written the best book on bodybuilding called The Perfectible Body, which is the definitive book on the subject. If you want to read that, Laura, I can't recommend it enough.
It's interesting looking at this stuff from kind of any other perspective than just the bodybuilding itself. Like, you would expect all of the writing to be aimed at people who are doing it, right? But what you're writing is not necessarily aimed at bodybuilders.
No, it's definitely not. That's a really, really good point. Because again, I've done a number of conferences where there have been a lot of bodybuilders in the audience, and I am the outsider. And again, like you two, there's something very attractive about, as academics, you want to be an outsider. I don't want to be part of the group. I've never liked that. And it's been very interesting talking to them about their own sport and just giving slightly different perspectives. And actually, it's always gone down really, really well, actually. Obviously, I've never tried to insult anyone. I've only ever had one moment where one individual got a bit funny, but I can't really
Was
talk about that because I could
was
get
that
libelous.
was that in the Q&A? Do they ask you, so do you even lift?
I think it was quite obvious that I did. I mean, I looked tiny. I looked like something from a Lowry painting compared to these people. I mean, they were absolutely enormous, but actually lovely. And the community is very interesting and very welcoming to me when I went to America a number of times to give papers to these sorts of people.
And so what's the attitude towards from the bodybuilders themselves? How do they feel about what they are doing, which I think they consider a sport, right?
I mean, that's
how do they consider people taking a theoretical interest in what for them is a very practical thing?
I think it's fine. I think it's interesting what you said about sport, though, because obviously we're talking about pumping iron, and I can't wait to hear what you two think about pumping iron. But the very first scene where we're seeing obviously Arnold and Franco Columbu with a ballerina, and you're thinking, what's going on? But actually, that I think is a very interesting comment on what bodybuilding is. It is sport. I think the sport part comes in the training because the training is brutal. It's brutal. And the art part comes obviously in the display of the body.
It's closer.
It's all about the aesthetic.
It's closer to kind of catwalk and a fashion show.
It is a little bit.
They're all just posing for the audience. Right?
But there's more with bodybuilding. There's pageantry as well. That's a big part of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask that actually. How far is it a sport? How far is it an art? Because one of the things in Pumping Iron that Arnold says early on is that he compares it to sculpting clay, sculpting the body, the self, the body, like a sculpture. And I just think that is really fascinating. And that kind of cued me in to think Arnold Schwarzenegger is a pretty interesting man, isn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, he's fascinating. I mean, two things. I mean, you're right. I mean, they are, I mean, this goes back, I mean, the sort of celebration of muscular men goes all the way back to, thousands of years, but particularly ancient statuary, Greek statuary, clearly. And these bodybuilders you're right, they are living statues. And in fact, when the filmmakers for Pumping Iron, they ran out of money, these bodybuilders were exhibited in a museum in New York and exhibited literally on these rotating podiums for historians of art who were talking about them as living works of art. And it's one of the few times bodybuilding hasn't been seen as kitsch and camp. It was actually looked at as high art at that point. But you're right, the sculpture link is a very, very strong one, and bodybuilders often have spoken about themselves as sculpture. Literally, almost like as Arnold says, isn't it? With his deltoids, it's like slapping on some clay here and there, and to enhance the body. Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, it might come as a surprise to people watching this film if you're more familiar with Arnold from his 80s action movies. He's very articulate. He's articulate in a way that he doesn't get much of a chance to do in his films, and so this sort of comes as a surprise, I think.
I think he's an absolute revelation. I mean, don't forget Arnold hadn't really been interviewed by anyone outside the bodybuilding subculture until after this film. I mean, he had done some films before this. He'd done the terrible Hercules in New York. I'm sure you're going to cover that at some point. Too.
I love that movie.
It's a powerful
it's
film.
Hilarious.
He'd also done The Long Goodbye, where he actually plays, I think, a sort of someone sort of hard of hearing who's also a mute, and Stay Hungry from '76 with Jeff Bridges and Sally Field. So he had done some movies, and clearly in Pumping Iron, he makes it very clear he wants to be an actor, doesn't he? That is what he's aiming for, and he'd already started that. And he just oozes charisma. And you're right, he's articulate, he's funny. You just want to be with him.
Yeah, he's such a personality. I mean, there's a really sort of a narcissistic element to it. But it's the kind of narcissism that, like you said, makes you want to be in the room and just like conversing with him for hours. You have so much to say.
Absolutely, and he's the centre of attention, isn't it? I mean, again, the film is very constructed, isn't it? With Lou Ferrigno, who's obviously his nemesis, and the poor downtrodden, huge bodybuilder with his dad, who seems to have no friends, but just this really bullying father, and Arnold, who's just surrounded by friends and women. They are clearly set as sort of binary opposites, aren't they, in this?
He just like the way he talks about women and the way he's just like offhand, he makes a comment about something to do with sex, and it's like he just doesn't care. Like he's just really comfortable with himself, with his body, and with his sexuality.
Well, he is, and you're right about the sexuality because he's talking about obviously the pump, the idea when you're filling the muscle with blood and it becomes so tight and it's like coming. So I'm coming in the gym and then I go home, I'm coming home, I'm coming all the time. So yeah, it is. And again, there's quite a sort of, I think, an ideological imperative behind pumping iron, that it is trying to heterosexualize something which had been quite demonized and sort of seen as, just for gay people, for gay men, which it wasn't. I mean, I should say Pumping Iron, it came out first as a book in 1974. And there's a lovely, well, it's not a lovely story, actually, it's an awful story. The New York Times actually refused to review it because they just called it fag bait. I mean, that's how it was looked at. I mean, so things have changed a lot, and bodybuilding was an important documentary for changing people's attitudes.
Yeah, you mentioned in your introductory chapter in the Critical Readings book about Steve Reeves, and obviously that sort of ties in with, he was appearing a lot in what they were calling beefcake magazines, I suppose, and the Peplum films. And when you read about the history of those, it does seem to be that the prime readership were gay men, and so there was an element of campness to all of this. And particularly, again, the Peplum films are often described as being very camp in the way the camera lingers on the male form. So I thought it was interesting. There's a complete lack of any homoeroticism at all in this film. That seems to be very deliberate.
You're right, although there are moments, aren't there? There's a moment where Arnold and the guy, there's a bodybuilder called Ed Corney, and they're literally showing each other their muscles in the shower together. I do think it's got a certain homoerotic or homosocial element. But you're right. It's very, very different. And clearly, again, there is a strong ideological imperative to change things, because bodybuilding really, particularly from the 50s, had started to get a very bad press. There was someone called Bob Miser, a magazine called, I think, Athletic Model Guild, which was basically a porn mag with bodybuilders, and that really tarnished the image even more, really. But yeah, so it's interesting, but how Arnold is trying to again heterosexualize things, after all that. But Steve Reeves was someone he really looked up to, I should say. A very important bodybuilder, actually. And again, that links to the opening of Pumping Iron as well. Do you remember the opening credits when we see all those old sort of strong images of strong men and muscle men? And some of those figures are very, very important for bodybuilding's history. There's two people up there in particular. One name you'll know, Charles Atlas. Mm-hmm. Charles Atlas, who you might remember in the back of comics.
Oh, absolutely. The kid getting sand kicked in his face.
That's right. And he was selling something called the dynamic tension method, which was really using your body's own resistance to build muscle. So he was actually a bodybuilder who didn't lift weights, but clearly he was an important person sort of Americanizing bodybuilding, because actually bodybuilding very much starts in Europe. There's another figure on that opening credits called Eugene Sandow, the last man we see in the opening credits, who's with a big moustache, and he does the somersault. You remember, he does a backflip, actually.
Oh yeah,
and he's actually credited as the first bodybuilder. So the early Schwarzenegger, who was making in the early 20th century something like $1,500 a week, exhibiting his body. I mean, he was a fabulously rich man. So, and he really helped, with the whole late 19th century fitness craze, which we always think it's the 70s and 80s where you get fitness craze, but actually it's the Victorians. That's where you get the birth of, I don't know, Kellogg cereal and stuff like that.
Yeah, they were total health fanatics, weren't they?
Totally, big time. But then it also tapers off really at the end of the First World War, and then comes back in the 20s and 30s in America. So yeah,
But it's all about the show, isn't it? It's about the display.
It is absolutely, and that's what these people are building up to. I mean, the extraordinary thing is they are obviously training. There's that lovely bit again in Pumping Iron where you see on the board they've got 101 days left till the Mr. Universe and the Mr. Olympia, and these people are training for literally to be exhibited just for a few hours. So you are training for years or months and months just for a few hours display, which is amazing, really. And it's all about how you look on the day. Are you going to be big enough? Are you going to be defined enough? And if you're not going to win, as we see with people like Mike Katz, bless him.
No, I love Mike Katz.
I really love the Because this was all new to me, to be honest. So I kind of found it really interesting the way the bodies moved when they were on display. You know, this kind of way to move your arms to make particular muscles stand out. There was a kind of art to it. And it also made me wonder, like, there must be so many ways that you can game that on the day. Like, if you dehydrate yourself and then drink lots of water, maybe. Or if you, like, there must be so many ways to make yourself pop and so many tricks and, you know, yeah.
There are, and you're right. And I love the way you say "make yourself pop." That's a great description. Yes. And yeah, it's very important. I mean, they are very dehydrated as well, because what you're trying to do is reduce how much water you've got in the body and reduce all the subcutaneous fat. So literally, your skin looks like tissue paper at the end, and that becomes much more extreme by the 80s, where you can see literally every sinew under the skin. Oh. I mean, there's another wonderful book by a guy called Sam Fussell. It's called, Confessions of an Unlikely Bodybuilder. And he talks about how at competition, he's got so little body fat, he can't even walk across the floor without being in pain, because there's no fat tissue on the bottom of his feet. I mean, it's just horrible.
It doesn't sound healthy at all.
No, again, without sounding libelous here, I don't think it's very healthy. At a extreme professional level, there's nothing healthy about bodybuilding.
No. And I was wondering, is there any crossover between what these guys do and, you know, people who do weightlifting in contests? Because I thought it was interesting that these guys are not lifting weights on stage. It's the body, but yet they can clearly lift pretty well.
They're strong. Yeah, these are strong people. They used to be, and then they separated, and so bodybuilding just became about just displaying the body. So that happened later on, sort of, I suppose, really the 30s and 40s, where bodybuilding became very clearly, it's just about this rather than what you're doing back there and showing how much you can lift. But you're right, Adrian. I mean, these guys are incredibly strong. I mean, there's another bodybuilder, a black bodybuilder actually, called Ronnie Coleman, who was Mr. Olympia for many years and was just living. You can see him on YouTube. You cannot believe how much he's lifting. But now, unfortunately, he's totally crippled. It's really sad when you see him. He's on crutches and in a very bad way.
Oh, God.
I know. Yeah. Check him out. Ronnie Coleman. But at the time, one of the most amazing physiques ever seen in bodybuilding.
The last thing to mention from what I've read of your writing on this, you mentioned about Schwarzenegger. You call him the apex and the nadir of American bodybuilding and the American classic body. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, particularly in line of what you just said about bodybuilding becoming more extreme after pumping iron.
Good question. You two are good. Clearly pumping iron is incredibly important because it puts bodybuilding on the map. Clearly, he is without doubt the greatest proponent, the greatest seller of bodybuilding, isn't he? There's no doubt about it. There's never been anyone like him since. So, he really does help bodybuilding become that much better known. There's a huge rise in the amount of gyms spreading across America and other countries. So it's very important. That's the apex. But the nadir is, unfortunately, it's a bit like... I'll give you an example in terms of horror films. In terms of after Psycho, you get Halloween, and people think, well, if you're going to make another slasher, you have to have more killings. You get more and more extreme, and it's a bit like that in bodybuilding. The bodies have become more and more extreme. I mean, you wouldn't believe some of the physiques which come out particularly by the 90s, so much bigger. In fact, it reached the point where I would say Arnold would struggle to win any of the amateur contests eventually because the bodies had moved on that far. And that was to do not only with, better dietary and training methods, but particularly, again, allegedly, drug usage. Because the cocktails of drugs being used by that point was extraordinary. Now, again, allegedly, I think it's very likely the bodybuilders in pumping iron would be using steroids, or particularly Dianabol, or D-Bull as it was called, which was a steroid which comes out in the 50s. But there were many, many more used after that, so it becomes far more extreme in terms of size and vascularity. And unfortunately, you get more deaths as well because of that as well.
Is that because it's kind of unregulated from that point of view? Was it not banned? Or?
Well, there have been moments where they've done drug testing, but I think it's been quite tokenistic because the trouble is, if you reduce the size of these guys and how ripped and diced and sliced they're the terms they use. You don't bring in the audience. People want to see freaks. And again, bodybuilding very much relates back to the freak show. People want to see extremity. People who are looking a little bit more normal aren't going to draw in the crowds. So in many ways, I think, allegedly, the authorities, I think, looked away more than they probably should have. And the same thing happened for female bodybuilding as well. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of female bodybuilding, which starts late 70s, and of course there's Pumping Iron 2, which is all about the women, an extraordinary documentary if you haven't seen it. You can see how far women go. But by the end of the 90s, the bodybuilding authorities, the IFBB, which is the International Federation of Bodybuilding, which is the main organizer of these contests, they actually ban the Miss Olympia in the end because they think it's gone too far and they don't think it's selling enough. So it's actually stopped.
I was going to ask about Pumping Iron 2 because I saw that before I saw Pumping Iron, the first one. And I was just kind of fascinated by the discourses around these two films because I think it's great to have your work and to be able to kind of I want to find articles on the male body and Pumping Iron and that from a gender studies perspective. I found that when I was kind of searching for things, Pumping Iron 2 was coming up a lot more because of the the way that it's framed is that because it's the female body, it's suddenly monstrous, and therefore we want to look at it, talk about it, write articles about it, think about the female body in relation to this. But the male body kind of gets lost in the conversation. And I just thought that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
And kind of sad.
The thing is, obviously, with male muscularity, it's a continuum, isn't it? It's much more accepted guys with big muscles or definitions, but as soon as it's a woman, it causes. I mean, it's more acceptable now. I go to my gym, and there are women there with bodies. You think, God, I wouldn't mind to look like that. I wouldn't mind a six pack like that. But when it's taken to an extreme, it's still seen as deeply problematic. And also, what you do get as well is, again, with drugs, is strange things happening to people's sexuality. So for the women, for example, if you're taking lots of steroids, you can start getting things like acromegaly, which is an extension of the jaw and the nose, hirsutism, hairs growing everywhere, dramatic clitoral enlargement. I mean, all these things are going on.
Well, this sounds just fabulous.
Exactly. And for that,
I'm going to take up bodybuilding.
Well, you've got to do it, Laura. And for men, what's dramatic is testicular atrophy. The testicles literally shrink to the size of peanuts, allegedly. And gynecomastia, you start getting much more breast tissue around the chest. All this stuff. So you start getting a reversal of the sexual characteristics because of the drugs going on. I know.
Wow.
So I know. So there's some weird stuff going on. It's absolutely fascinating.
It is, yeah.
But clearly, those well-documented side effects do not put people off.
No, they don't. And obviously steroids, I mean this is a whole other conversation, are a big problem. They're a big problem with, particularly young boys. They are a major problem. And unfortunately people, don't think, are you really going to think at 16 about the side effects? You just want to get big. Years ago, I joined a gym in Eastbourne, actually, I won't mention the name, and I was shocked to be offered as soon as I joined Dynable. I couldn't believe it. I was absolutely gobsmacked. They were giving them out like sweeties. I didn't take them, obviously. I was surprised, so there you go. Eastbourne.
It's a dodgy place here. Be careful. Everywhere you go, people are massive.
So how did you, out of interest, what did you both make of Pumping Iron? I know you've already spoken about it, but how did you find it as a documentary?
I loved it.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. It's such a long time ago that we spoke about it. It was like a week ago in term time. Yeah. That's like 3 months. I loved the sort of way that it looked, the way that the documentary was sort of positioned. It felt like we were positioned within this world, not looking outside. Yes. So it wasn't particularly kind of this is freakish and this is extreme. It felt like, we are the world of bodybuilding and we're inviting you in. And that the camera was always positioned as though we were in the room with the bodybuilders and that we were getting a sort of privileged insight. I found it fascinating how these bodybuilders looked at each other, how they admired each other. I kind of really enjoyed the sort of banter that they had. It felt very familiar. And it was just a really well-constructed documentary, I thought. Like, the choices were interesting. To open it with a ballet class is a very interesting and intentional choice. It is a thesis. It is telling us something. It is prompting us.
So I really like the way that if these guys walked into a room, you would be quite overwhelmed and intimidated by these guys. But the way that we spend time with them, they're just normal people. They've got normal family relationships. They they play pranks on each other. I thought it did a really good job of humanizing them and making
I
them
think
quite
that's such a
relatable.
good point by you both, and I think you're right. I mean, there are lots of close-ups as well, aren't there, in this? And it's all about familiarizing the unfamiliar, and that's going on a lot in that. So I think it sounds like it succeeded in trying to bring us in and have an affinity with these people who are in many other respects totally alien to us, particularly as they're in Gold's Gym, Venice Beach, which I've never been to. It's a world. It is the mecca of bodybuilding, but I've never been there. So I think that's really interesting points by both of you.
I mentioned before as well that there are parts of it that feel like we're watching a Christopher Guest film, especially the character of Mike Katz.
Oh, Mike,
he feels straight out of a like a Best in Show or one of those.
I love Mike.
He's hilarious,
and he's a primary school teacher, isn't he? As well.
Yeah. Oh,
and when he doesn't win, and he's so I must go and shake his hand and think, oh my god,
he's such a nice man. He's so nice.
I know, and yet he's one of the ones who's rather bullied, isn't he? In it, but again, it's very. We should stress this is a drama documentary.
Yeah.
There are lots of things in it which are just done for camera. Which again is quite interesting. So when his t-shirt's hidden, Butler actually plays that up to make it look much worse than it was, really, for dramatic effect. I mean, there are lots of things like that. Also, things like Schwarzenegger when he was talking about not going to his dad's funeral, and you're thinking, oh my god, that was not true. That was just for dramatic effect. So all these things, and even Lou Ferrigno's dad, who trains with him, is a real character. His dad never trained with him, but Butler said, Butler again said, actually, it'd be great if for the documentary, we just pretend that you always train with him, with your son. Went, okay, I'll do it. So that was totally fictionalized.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting.
So this does cross a few lines then.
It crosses quite a few lines, yes. I'm trying to remember his name, but originally as well, they had, what's his name? I'm trying to look up here what his name is. I've completely forgotten. The chap who was the star of Harold and Maude. I can't remember his name. Is it Bud?
I'm blanking.
He was originally seen, they shot over 100 hours for Pumping Iron. It was much, much longer. And they had Bud Cort being mentored. They had him being mentored by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was going to help him turn into a big guy. And Bud just thought his scenes were too distracting. So in the end, he left and gave all the money back as well, which was very nice. So he gave his fee back. But that would have been in it as well, which would have been really, quite another fascinating narrative. But I think in the end, it was a wise decision to remove him. You can see that on YouTube, the outtake.
So you did another book a couple of years later called Body Studies. And was that still connected to bodybuilding, or was that a slightly different area for you?
All sorts. Everything from cyborgs, but there was actually a chapter on bodybuilding as well in that. So yes, there was one more. I had a bit more of the bodybuilding stuff to get out. Yes, so I had to sort of purge myself once more. But not again, Adrian, it's done.
No.
My work is done.
So do you teach on it at all?
I don't
do you
actually
teach gender studies?
I do, I do. Well, gender comes into, for example, I do American TV drama modules, so that's all based around gender and sexuality to look at the various TV shows. So yes, I do, but I don't talk about bodybuilding anymore. I used to give guest lectures on it all the time, but like probably you and Adrian, you just moved to new pastures, don't you?
Yeah.
Eventually, so not anymore. But it's still fascinating, and so much is it's changing all the time. It's transmogrifying. A lot of the bodybuilding magazines, which were really influential, have gone, obviously, because of the way things are now. So things have really, really changed. Female bodybuilding is in better health again, but I'm not as in touch with it as I used to be, because obviously I'm not analysing.
Well, we teach a gender studies course here at Hull, and I just think I teach on it, and that's just a great week, isn't it? Like bodybuilding, the history of bodybuilding and the body, and
Yes.
yeah.
So you don't have anyone talking about bodybuilding yet for any of your courses? No.
Give
me a ring. Send me
an email.
Yeah, no. Well, it's because actually it's one of those things which really does get students very interested, because obviously these are quite shocking images sometimes for some people, because clearly when you see it, obviously, if I sent you what's going on now, it is really jaw dropping. Compared to pumping iron, seems so quaint, and even when you go back to pumping iron, you see the gyms look so primitive.
That Brooklyn gym, it's amazing. It's
I love that.
Low rent.
It's so low. I mean, obviously, again, that's for the whole purposes of the drama, isn't it? It's dark, it's dingy, it's full of people who look like they've never lifted a weight. You've got that guy in the white t-shirt, haven't you, doing dumbbell reps? Who clearly,
I love that guy.
He's fantastic.
That's so funny.
He's great. And then, of course, that's contrasted with what's going on in Gold's Gym, which has all the, the light coming through the skylights. And it's right by the palm trees and the beach and the sea. And, clearly, again, it's making very strong contrasts.
It's very, it's very New Hollywood. It's very, Rocky. It's got that vibe.
Well, that's interesting you've said that, because Franco Columbo, who obviously is Arnold's friend, although Arnold, there's that lovely bit later in the documentary where obviously they're going to have to compete together, aren't they, later on? Arnold in the over 200-pound class, Franco in the under 200. And, basically Arnold says he's going to win again because basically Franco is like his son. He's like like a child, and he will basically tell him lies, so he loses. But Franco, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but Franco trained Sylvester Stallone actually for, I think, the Rambo films. So he was his personal trainer for that. So there's a connection there. But yeah. Anyway, tenuous, but there you go.
I kind of love that Lou Ferrigno went for the Hulk role and Arnold went as well, and he lost out because he wasn't tall enough. So I just think, wow.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I read that Arnold turned it down because he said he was too good looking. So
well, I can't remember what my source was. It could be that it was wrong. It may have, it was some autobiography somewhere.
Well, of course Arnold would say that, wouldn't he?
Of course he would. But of course Lou did really, really well. And I think, how did you both feel about Lou? Because obviously Arnold is running rings around Lou. And how did you feel about Lou and Arnold's character in it?
I thought Lou was, it is heavily dramatized. I thought Lou was just quietly introverted.
Yeah.
And he was aware that he was being taken the piss out of, but he was just kind of getting on with it. I really liked Lou. I think he had a rich internal life that we never got to see because we're so focused on the obvious charisma of Arnie.
I really liked that bit right at the end when they're both sitting on the back row of the coach when they're going back to the airport, whatever it is. And
it's my favourite scene.
After all that competition, they're still basically like little boys just messing around, having a good time together. And you can tell that there's no real animosity between them at all. There's a kind of healthy rivalry, but they're still basically mates.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's a very salient observation because, again, Butler and Gaines had to just play up the rivalry when actually these people got on much better than it appears on screen. And I think you're right, on the coach, it's quite clear. In fact, they do get on, better than you think. But, Lou was very upset by the documentary. When it was released, he was very worried how he came across. And at the time, he didn't speak very much. Obviously, he had this terrible ear infection, which gave him a very difficult time not being able to hear very well at all. So, and being very downtrodden by his father. So he was quite as a victim in all sorts of ways. So in some ways, Arnold baiting him up when he's baiting him up before they go on stage made me feel very quite fatherly towards Lou because he's having bad enough time as it was really with his dad and his disability. But you're right. I think the conflict is absolutely played up, and there are moments we realise it's actually not quite as bad as the filmmakers are suggesting. And I should sorry say very, very quickly. Pumping Iron brought bodybuilding back, into the limelight, but it's crawled back under a rock in many ways. It's become so extreme. It's almost as subcultural as it was before Pumping Iron again. So it's sort of looped in on itself in many ways. but we like that as academics.
Yeah. We didn't really mention the other documentary about the making of pumping iron. Wasn't there another documentary?
Raw.
Yes.
Yeah, Raw. I haven't seen that for a long time. That was released 25 years or something afterwards, I think. Yeah, where some of them look so old. Mike Katz, oh my goodness, it's quite a shock to see him. Whereas Arnold looks incredible. But I suppose you would when you're a Hollywood.
He's always going to look incredible, right? He's got an army of personal trainers and access to the best stuff.
Well, exactly. But I think Raw. Yes, is interesting because again, it does talk about the 100 hours of shooting and the various roles or sort of character stereotypes they wanted to sort of play into to make it as dramatic as possible. But Raw is worth. I think it's on YouTube actually. I need to watch that.
Awesome.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam. It was very interesting as always.
Thanks, Adam.
And I'm sure we'll be getting you back on the show at some point. The show. We'll be getting you back on the podcast again. I'm so pretentious. At some point in the future.
Thank you.
I'll
retire to the green room. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Do you want to do the ending as well, or do you want me to do it?
I don't mind. That's the end of the show. Actually, let's literally just have that ending. You asking me if I want to do it, and then me saying that's the end of the show.
Yeah. So there we go.
Another smooth ending.
Yeah. I wanted to just mention, I keep forgetting to do this actually, that we have listeners around the world. I think we might have mentioned this before, but I just thought it would be cool to say that we've got listeners in Ireland, we've got listeners in Australia, America, and the UK. Those are our main places. But we've also apparently had but at least one person has listened in Egypt.
Egypt?
I know. Canada, Belgium, France, Poland, I think we know about because of our Polish one. Japan, India, Malaysia.
That's incredible. We're like a broadcasting tour de force, Adrian.
I know. So if you're listening and you're in one of those countries, please do get in touch because we'd love to hear from you and hear what it was that drew you to us. Maybe leave us a review on whatever local podcasting app you're using there. But it's cool. So it's nice to think that we have a global audience for our waffles.
Totally.
So how can they get in touch with us, Laura?
Well, we are on Twitter at Second Features. And you can also just tweet me or Adrian individually. I am at Laura Jane Main. And Adrian, you are Retro Ramblings, aren't you?
At Retro Ramblings.
At Retro Ramblings. We also have a Gmail, which does anyone email us? Because
only bots.
Okay. If you're a bot, you can email our Gmail and only our Gmail.
Which is at secondfeaturespod@gmail.com. So please do get in touch. Or you can also leave us comments. We've got a YouTube channel. Our podcasts are over on YouTube as well. So if you want to find us on there, then you could leave us comments on the episodes. Our Sex Mission episode is actually very popular on YouTube, believe it or not. Well, I say very. I'm not talking millions, but people are listening to us on YouTube as well. So that would be fun to.
Nice.
We'd just like to hear from you and what you think about it, and suggestions for future films, or if you're an academic with some research that you'd love to come on and chat to us about. We are always open to ideas.
Open to ideas and suggestions for films that we might do.
Oh, and we should plug our Blu-ray that's coming out this month.
It's not our Blu-ray, just to say. We happen to have recorded a commentary track for the upcoming network on-air release of The Monster, aka I Don't Want to Be Born, starring Joan Collins.
AKA Sharon's Baby.
AKA many other titles, too numerous to actually name.
Yeah.
Genuinely.
So if you're one of the people who's listened to that commentary and you want to tell us what you thought about that, you can contact us as well.
Unless you thought it was shit, in which case, keep your opinion to yourself.
Yes, thanks, and don't be so rude.
No, it's fine. We accept constructive feedback.
And so thank you for listening. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Adam Locks. And you can find him. He doesn't really do social media, but he has got a podcast coming up, as he mentioned. So that's worth listening out for. And once we find out when that is happening, we'll tweet about it.
Awesome. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you and goodbye.